Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Asaf Ramarowski. I am the Executive Director of ASMIA, and it's my pleasure to welcome you once again to our first webinar of the series this academic year. And this afternoon, we have the privilege and pleasure to host our friend and colleague, Cole Bunzel. Cole is a Hoover Fellow at the Hoover Institute in Stanford, and above all, he is also the book review editor of our journal at ASMIA here, the Journal for Middle East and Africa. He's a trained Middle East historian, a specialist in the Arabian Peninsula, deals with Islamic theology and law and modern Islamic radicalism. This afternoon, he's going to talk to us about his most recent book, Wahhābism, The History of the Militant Islamic Movement, which is a highly recommended book for all of you to read. If you haven't got a copy yet, you should do so. The format this afternoon, for those of us who've been with us in the past, know, and I'll repeat it again now for all newcomers, Cole will talk for about a half hour or so. Then from there, we will go into Q&A. If you have a question, and we encourage as many questions as you may have, please type them in the chat. I do apologize in advance if we don't get to all your questions this afternoon. We apologize in advance, so feel free to reach out to us, email us after the webinar, and we'll do our best to respond in a timely fashion. I will also want to put out a plug. Our upcoming ASMIA conference is going to set to take place this coming November, the weekend of November 4th. Cole will be talking there, so if you want to hear more about Cole and more about his research, we encourage all of you to come and hear all about us and see us all in person. So really, without further ado, Cole, I know you're on the West Coast, so good morning. And the virtual floor is now yours.
Well, thank you, Asaf. I will share the screen. I have a little PowerPoint. Now that's working. Well, thank you all for being here this morning or afternoon, wherever you are. This is a webinar about my new book, Wahhābism, The History of a Militant Islamic Movement, which came out, I believe, in May. I'll talk in some detail about part of the book. It's quite a long book, perhaps heavy in some areas, so I certainly won't get into all the details. But I hope that you'll come away with a sense of what this book is all about. I should say, of course, that it's perhaps appropriate we're meeting on September the 11th, the 22nd anniversary of the 9/11 attacks carried out by Al-Qaeda. It was the 9/11 attacks that actually inspired a lot of new scholarship, some of it good, some of it somewhat shoddy, about Wahhabism. Wahhabism, of course, being the movement that's indigenous to Saudi Arabia, a version of Sunni Islam. 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudi citizens who came from a Wahhabi background. Osama bin Laden, of course, was a Saudi who appealed to the Wahhabi heritage as part of the jihadi ideology. More broadly, jihadism, as it's developed since the 1980s, in particular, the Sunni jihadi movement around Al-Qaeda and ISIS today, it appeals quite clearly and repeatedly to Wahhabism as one of the main features of its ideology. So Wahhabism is very much part of what's going on in the Islamic radical movement known as jihadism today. That being said, I think I should also note that I don't believe that the 9/11 attacks or ISIS are the inevitable outgrowth of Wahhabism. Wahhabism, as we'll see shortly, is much more concerned with the internal dynamics of the Islamic world, with policing proper belief, going after what they see as polytheism or shirk, than it is concerned with the West, with the Christians and the Jews. You don't get a lot of that in the Wahhabi tradition. So I'll talk a little bit more, hopefully at the end, about how Wahhabism has played a role in the jihadi movement. But the book and what I'm going to talk about today is primarily concerned with understanding Wahhabism on its own terms. And to understand what the book is about and what its contributions are, I think it's important to begin with just a brief overview of what Wahhabism is, its history, and its relationship to the Saudi dynasty, the Al Saud. So I'll start there. Wahhabism, Al-Wahhabiyya in Arabic, is the name of the movement that began in the mid-18th century in central Arabia, an area called Nejd. and its namesake is Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, who was a preacher born in around 1703, dies in 1792. He's from this area here, which I've highlighted. It's called Nejd, which means upland. It's a large plateau area, and he comes not from the desert, however. Some people have this idea of Wahhabism being a kind of Bedouin phenomenon. It's actually the product of settled areas, these towns or settlements that grew up in places that had date palms. They were oases. So that's where he comes from. He comes from a family of religious scholars, but he didn't believe that the religious scholars who were teaching him, even his own father, that they understood the meaning of there is no God but God, of Tawheed. So he launches a mission in 1741, right after his father dies. And that word da'wah, or mission, is very critical to understanding Wahhabism. It's sometimes said, even by the Saudi leaders, including Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman today, that Wahhabism does not exist. It's never existed. Well, what they really mean by that is that Wahhabism is nothing but true Islam, or at least that's what they used to mean. MBS, and I'll talk about that maybe a little at the end, he doesn't even really want to highlight Wahhabism as being a critical part of Saudi Arabia's history. But that aside, if you look at the sources themselves in Arabic, the way that the Wahhabi scholars discuss their movement is called a da'wah in Najdiyah, or the Najdi da'wah. So it's very much a historical phenomenon, a movement that has its own particular doctrinal features. So the main focus in Wahhabism, in the da'wah in Najdiyah, is on Tawheed, the proper understanding of God's oneness, or monotheism, which in their view means to direct all worship to God. So they see any sort of worship, say at a shrine, at a gravesite, anything that is directed at a saint, saying, "Oh, Abdul Qadir, help me with this." They believe that that is shirk, or polytheism, associating other beings with God, and that means that those people are not true Muslims. They're not Muslims at all, and they need to be subject to takfir, or excommunication, declared to be unbelievers. So the main thing that was grinding Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's gears in this era was hostility to the cult of saints. There was these practices existed, and to some extent still do exist, across the Islamic world. Saints or holy men, sometimes prophets, would be visited by believers, by normal everyday Muslims, and they would pray to the saints, or they would or seek blessings from the saints, things like that. And Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab did not want to tolerate that, and he was very, very animated in his movement, and it spread quite quickly like wildfire. I should say real quickly, he was also influenced in particular in his doctrine by the ideas of an earlier scholar named Ibn Taymiyyah, who dies in 1328 in Damascus. He's a Syrian Hanbali scholar. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is also a Hanbali. Hanbalism is one of the four schools of law, and that plays some role in the development of Wahhabism. So that's the beginning of Wahhabism, 1741. In 1744, Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was being persecuted in another town. He moves to the town of Ad-Dir'iyah, where the ruler is a man named Muhammad bin Saud. And that is generally understood as the beginning of the first Saudi state. And the first Saudi state, which is the product of an alliance between Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and Muhammad bin Saud. Muhammad bin Saud agrees to support the preacher, to host the preacher and his da'wah, and to make it part of the Dir'iyah Emirate. And the Dir'iyah Emirate starts to expand. It starts to conquer neighboring territories in the name of Da'wah Najdiyah, in the name of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's doctrine, on the basis that the people there are not practicing Islam properly, and therefore they need to be fought in jihad. So that begins in 1744. This is a map, I think. It shows where the first Saudi state, as it was developing, it begins in Nejd, in this area. This is approximately, I think, the 1760s. It takes a while for the first Saudi state to develop, but over time, you get this development. The first Saudi state conquers all of the Arabian Peninsula with the exception of the southern areas. So in in the 1790s, it conquers the eastern provinces, known as Al-Hassa or Lahsa, where there are rich date palm oases. And in the early 1800s, it conquers Mecca and Medina and the Hijaz. And when it conquers Mecca and Medina and the Hijaz, that elicits the outrage of the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire sends Muhammad Ali, deputizes Muhammad Ali with the mission of going and retrieving the holy cities, which they do in the 1810s. And after that, Muhammad Ali decides we're actually going to go all the way to Dar'iyah, and they raze Dar'iyah to the ground. They destroy the first Saudi state. The head of the first Saudi state, a man named Abdullah Saud, is brought to Cairo, and then from Cairo to Istanbul, where he is beheaded in a public square. And that, many people would think, is the end of the first Saudi state. But in fact, the Saudi political project, with its alliance with Wahhabism, it reemerges in 1823, and there is a new Saudi state with the capital at Riyadh. And that Saudi state, at its height, it conquers the eastern provinces. It never conquers Mecca and Medina. It fights its jihad in the name of the ideas of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, once again, the idea of purifying Islam of shirk and spreading true Islam, that is Tawheed. But it never was able to conquer Mecca and Medina, and it falls apart. It disintegrates in an ugly civil war. But you have a third Saudi state that emerges in 1902, founded by a man named Abdulaziz Al Saud. He conquers Riyadh in 1902. He reestablishes the Saudi Wahhabi Pact, and that statelet in Riyadh quickly expands, takes over Najd, and it conquers the eastern provinces, the western provinces, and that country becomes to be known as the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in 1932. So that's the modern Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, founded in 1932. Now, the interesting thing about that period with Abdulaziz as the king is that while he supports Wahhabism, he endorses the Wahhabi scholars, and he's quite close to them, he also neutralizes them in a sense. He brings them into the state project, but he also does not allow them to dictate what the state is going to be about. So Abdulaziz, for instance, did not want to kill and fight the Shia in the eastern provinces, who the Wahhabis believe should not be allowed to exist, essentially. So he ignores a lot of the advice of the Wahhabi scholars, who are still in the early 1900s. They believe that lands such as Iraq and Egypt and Syria are not really Islamic lands. These are lands, they say, Dawlat al-Shirk. This is the state of polytheism. The Ottoman Empire is not seen as a place that is Islamic at all. It's a place that ought to be ideally conquered. So he basically subjugates the Wahhabis. He neutralizes the Wahhabi scholars, and the Wahhabi doctrine is sort of sapped of its more extreme militant properties. So that's sort of the general outline. A lot of that was understood. So when it comes to my book, though, what got me interested in Wahhabism here, I was reading a lot of the jihadi texts that were citing Wahhabi scholars. And so I started looking into the biographies of Wahhabi scholars. And the most interesting one to me was a man named Suleiman ibn Sahman, who dies in 1930. I think he's born in the 1850s. His life spanned the end of the second Saudi state, the beginning of the third Saudi state. He was the most prolific author in the movement. He wrote in prose. He captured the doctrine of Wahhabism clearly, with its emphasis on hatred and enmity toward polytheists. But the more I read Ibn Sahman, the more I understood that he was really just recycling, and sometimes just with long quotations, the earlier Wahhabi tradition. And I didn't think that the existing scholarship on Wahhabism, such as it was, did justice to this movement. And I thought there's really a lot more to be done, a lot more to be done. This is a movement that did not attract a whole lot of academic attention. It didn't attract the interest of early Orientalists very much. I can understand perhaps why. It's a movement that's very much perhaps not appealing to a lot of people in its exclusivism and its militancy. A lot of the sources also were not available. So what I do in the book is I delve into a lot of not just the Wahhabi sources, which in many cases had not been used adequately, but I also look at a lot of the anti-Wahhabi sources. So a lot of when Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab begins his movement in the 1740s, this elicits a flurry of refutations all over the neighboring lands in the Hijaz, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Syria. And these scholars are writing against Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in the fiercest possible terms. Some in the Hijaz are calling for his head, even before he's part of the state with the El Saud. They say in some cases that he's crazy and perhaps he should be taking medication for his insanity. And if that doesn't work, then he should be jailed and perhaps killed. A lot of these scholars saw Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab as an extremely offensive figure, which is understandable because he was effectively accusing them of not being Muslims at all. So a lot of these refutations were produced as early as 1742, and I look at what they say. They were difficult to obtain, some from various libraries from Iraq and India, Saudi Arabia, Germany, even Princeton. You'll see the cover here of the book shows the end of a manuscript that was written in, I think, 1742 by a scholar in the Hijaz, and that is at the library in Princeton University, just by coincidence. So a lot of that is very fun to do. And I'll give an example of this shortly. So I use a lot of that, and I try to reconstruct the biography of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab as best as I can and as fairly as I can. He's depicted as, a supreme intellect by the Wahhabi tradition. He's portrayed as a false prophet by the anti-Wahhabis. So I try to reconcile that and to come to an understanding of what he was about. I look at the nature of Wahhabi doctrine in detail. Perhaps half of the book is concerned with understanding the bases of Wahhabism in the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah and his student Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. These are the two 14th century Syrian thinkers who in their day were understood as very radical. But compared to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, they were not nearly as radical. So there's a lot of that in the book. A lot of the understanding that Ibn Taymiyyah was important to Wahhabism, that's long been kind of acknowledged. There's one book, however, that claimed that Ibn Taymiyyah was nothing but a marginal influence on Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And I think I show that to be completely bogus. After this, I look at the development of the first Saudi state. It's really one of the more interesting things, I think, in modern Middle Eastern history. First of all, how does it emerge? There had not been state formation in about 500 years, 5 centuries in this area. It's Wahhabism, in my belief, that kind of energizes this area into producing a state. And that state, as many, I think, don't quite understand, if you look at what the early Saudi leaders were saying, and they were writing epistles to places in Iraq and Syria, they were trying to conquer those areas. They were calling them lands of unbelief that needed to be fought, purged of shirk, etc. So after looking at that, I look at the persistence of Wahhabi militancy into the early 20th century. So Wahhabism, as it was developing in the mid 18th and later 18th centuries, it becomes a very exclusivist, very militant movement that does not acknowledge the status of Islam in most of the Islamic world. There's some ambiguity in certain of the statements of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, but those are not reflected in the later development of the movement, where a lot of the kind of doctrinal tenets are maintained in their most puritanical, kind of unforgivable way. But then I show how that is essentially watered down in the early 20th century. There's also what's a lot of fun to do in this period, in the 19th century in particular, is to look at a lot of the polemics that were going on back and forth between the kind of standard bearers of the Wahhabi doctrine in Riyadh, a lot of whom were the descendants of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab himself. These people are known as the Sheikh, the family of the Sheikh. The Sheikh is Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab. And they were trying to uphold the true standard of Wahhabism as against a lot of people who were trying to water it down, to say things like, it's okay to travel to the, quote, lands of unbelief, that is Iraq, Syria, and other places. The Wahhabi scholars in Riyadh said it's not okay. You can't show hatred and enmity to the people there. Those places are not lands of Islam. We need to shun them and avoid them. That kind of thing persisted in quite perfect form, really, until the early 20th century, until the rise of the Third Saudi state. So with the rest of my time here, I thought I would give a good example of how I use the Wahhabi and particularly the anti-Wahhabi sources to reconstruct early Wahhabi history and something of the early Wahhabi doctrine. And what's interesting is that the Wahhabi sources, they give a pretty good overview of early Wahhabism, but a lot of the writings of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab are not dated. So we don't know exactly what he was writing and when, how it was received, etc. The refutations against him actually allow us to put dates on some of his writings because, and a lot of the refutations, this was the kind of format that one would write a refutation in at this time. It was to take the epistle by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab and to quote it in its entirety and comment on every little thing that you thought was awful with it. And so that's what a lot of the early refuters did. And what's so interesting about that is it preserves the early epistle by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab in the refutation. I call that the embedded epistle. And then you can look at that epistle and understand, okay, it was written at this time because the refutation is dated in this time, and we know it. And then you can put sort of dates around things. So a lot of the early chapter of the book is trying to do that with respect to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's early writings. So before I do that, though, one of the main kind of contributions, I should say, of the book is to highlight something that I think none of the existing literature on Wahhabism quite captured, which was the centrality of a certain doctrine in Wahhabism. Wahhabism is often associated with the idea of takfir, of declaring other Muslims to be unbelievers. And that's true. That's a very prominent part of Wahhabism. But another thing that stands out when you look at Wahhabi writings is this theme of the duty to show hatred and enmity to those who are perceived to be polytheists, and bughd wal adawa to al-mushrikeen. So here you have a lot of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's early writings where he says things like Islam is not sound without showing enmity to the polytheists. If you do not show them enmity, then if one does not show them enmity, then he is one of them, even if he has not committed it, i.e. shirk. A person's religion and Islam are not sound, even if he professes tawheed and eschews shirk, unless he shows enmity to the polytheists. And I can't see this line because of my the screen. And he professes enmity and hatred of them. So this idea that he was putting on display in a lot of his writings was that, yes, you can understand tawheed properly, which means that you avoid shrine visitation, you direct all worship to God, but still you haven't met the test of Islam until you show hatred and enmity to the polytheists. The polytheists are essentially, they're not defined, but the understanding is that they are the bad Muslims around us who pray to shrines or who tolerate shrine worship. So this theme carries on into the early 20th century, this idea that you have to display enmity and hatred in order to be a proper Muslim. And you can see that what's so interesting is that this theme crops up in the earliest refutation that we have of Wahhabism from 1742. I'll go back to that, which is called Fasl al-Khitab fi Rad Dalalat Ibn Abdul Wahhab, the decisive statement in refutation of the errors of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, which was written by a Iraqi scholar in southern Iraq, in Basra, named Ahmed al-Qabbani. And Ahmed al-Qabbani, who finishes his refutation in 1742, I should say this is an image of it. This is the only copy of the refutation that survives, and it survives in a library in Baghdad. Well, he finished it in December 1742, but he also gives us a little more information. He says that in mid-1742, a risala, that is an epistle by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, arrives in Basra. And it says some crazy stuff. And he was asked by somebody to write a refutation of it, which he did. And it is an extremely long refutation, extremely detailed, and it's extremely valuable for the early history of Wahhabism. And the epistle by Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab that he is refuting is called Kalimat fi Bayan Shahadat and La ilaha illallah, words and explication of the confession that there is no God but God. And so it's looking at that epistle that allows us to understand a lot of what was going on with early Wahhabism, what he was promoting in his epistles at this time. So if you look at the refutation, or not the refutation, at the epistle that is embedded in the refutation, It begins with, these are words in explication of the confession that there is no God but God, and of Tawheed, which is God's due from mankind. And he gives a long kind of overview of what Tawheed means, which in his view is directing all worship to God. And he ends by noting that dua, or supplication, is a form of worship. Dua being the way that one would appeal to saints or prophets at grave sites. So that's the general view. And to understand what is upsetting him, what is the cult of saints, I think it's important to look at this one passage here, where he kind of gives a good understanding of what it is that he's trying to eradicate from Islamic practice. So reflect, may God have mercy on you, on the supplication of other than God, dua ghayr Allah, in times of hardship and in times of comfort that has afflicted mankind. Such and such a person intends to travel, so he goes to the grave of a prophet or someone else and comes to it with his wealth in order to avert robbery. Such and such a person is afflicted by hardship on land or on sea, so he seeks the help of Abdul Qadir or Shamsan or a prophet or a saint, that he may relieve him of this hardship. So this, in Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab's view, is shirk. This idea of appealing to the saint Abdul Qadir, who is a Hanbali saint in Iraq, or Shamsan, who was a local saint in Najd. Any sort of seeking the help of these people was shirk, and those people needed to be castigated. They needed to be subject to takfir, and they needed to be shown hatred and enmity. And this is where you find the duty of hatred and enmity in its first expression, its earliest expression. He says, after outlining the proper view of Tawheed, and he condemns shirk in the form of the cult of saints, he then goes on to the next part of the duty, which is, do not think if you say, this is the truth, I follow it and I abjure all that contradicts it, but I will not confront them. I will say nothing concerning them. Do not think that that will profit you. Rather, it is necessary to hate them, to hate those who love them, to revile them, and to show them enmity. And that is this duty that the refuter in Basra thought to be one of the most offensive things he had ever read. And he puts this all in terms of Islamic practice, and basically he's arguing is that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is a heretic, and he also notes that he's reviving the wicked ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah from the 14th century. He essentially sees Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab as the reincarnation of Ibn Taymiyyah, which is a little unfair. He does acknowledge that Ibn Taymiyyah wasn't as radical, perhaps, as Ibn Abdul Wahhab, but he writes two more refutations, I should say, of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and they're also quite valuable in understanding what was going on. Now, the next part of Wahhabism, as the movement is developing, as the state with the El Saud is developing, concerns the addition of jihad as a duty alongside the display of hatred and enmity. So we find, as the state is developing, that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab also begins to insert into his epistles that one has to fight the polytheists. So he says in one of his epistles from about 1753, may God have mercy on him who considers and reflects upon the command received by Muhammad from God to show enmity to those who commit shirk, near or far, to pronounce takfir on them, and to fight them till the religion is God's entirely. So that is the sort of standard Wahhabi doctrine as it is first expressed in the 1750s, probably a little earlier. We can't date all the epistles. It's the idea that one is not a true Muslim, one has not fulfilled the duty of Tawheed until one shows hatred and enmity to the polytheists, and if one is able also to fight them in jihad. And if you look at the subsequent development of Wahhabism over the coming century and a half, a lot of the times when the followers of Ibn Abdul Wahhab are commenting on his writings, or are just writing epistles to themselves or other writings, they gloss the term enmity, adawa, as jihad. They don't see a great deal of distinction between the display of enmity and fighting somebody in religious warfare in order to expand the ambit of true Islam. So that is one of the things that I try to do in the book to reconstruct a lot of the early development of Wahhabism, the doctrine of Wahhabism, to look at, I also look in some detail at where these ideas come from in the thought of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. I think that in most cases, Ibn Abdul Wahhab is taking the ideas of Ibn Taymiyyah and applying them in a much more radical, kind of untamed manner. ways that really don't accord with the teachings of Ibn Taymiyyah, which were quite radical in some ways. But Ibn Abdul Wahhab is really he was unrestrained to a large extent, and that lack of restraint continues until the early 20th century. And here are just a few examples of other scholars, the successors of Ibn Abdul Wahhab, who would say similar things about hatred and enmity. So Abdurrahman ibn Hassan al-Sheikh was pretty much the chief scholar in the second Saudi state. This is from one of his epistles. God has made it a duty to dissociate from polytheism and polytheists, to reject them, to show them enmity and hatred, and to wage jihad against them. Hamid ibn Atiq dies in 1884, also lived mostly under the second Saudi state. A man has not manifested his religion until he dissociates from the unbelievers who are in his midst and states plainly to them that they are unbelievers and that he is their enemy. If that has not happened, the religion has not been manifested. Suleiman ibn Sahman, who I said was the scholar I thought of writing biography at the beginning, he says, and he lived during the second and the third Saudi states, manifesting this religion is clearly pronouncing to them that they are unbelievers, for indeed they are an unbelieving people, an evident enmity and manifest hatred. This is manifesting the religion and proper condemnation. And a lot of these ideas were implemented in these scholars' writings for the purpose of saying that it is not proper, it is not allowed to visit the lands of so-called polytheists, because people in, say, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, you cannot manifest your religion there properly, because that would entail you saying, you are my enemy, I hate you, you don't practice Islam, you're unbelievers, and that would elicit their enmity in turn, making it impossible for you to visit there, to live there properly and expressing Islam. So their view was that it's not sufficient to pray 5 times a day, to do the other parts, the other 5 pillars of Islam. No, this was a central feature, a central doctrinal requirement of a true Muslim, to be able to show hatred and enmity to those who are perceived as unbelievers. And that essentially captured the entire Ottoman Empire, which was still into the early 20th century understood as a land of polytheism. Now, coming to the present, very quickly, I know I've run over the 30 minutes. I just want to say that in the 1980s, so the Wahhabis have sort of toned down the doctrine, not really in theory, but in practice, they toned down the doctrine from the 1930s onward. It's still a very intolerant movement in Saudi Arabia, but the more radical features, those kinds of comments about the necessary display of hatred and enmity, and the understanding that applies to most professed Muslims, that is suppressed in the third Saudi state, in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. But beginning in the 1980s in particular, the jihadi movement, the movement associated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, it begins to appeal to the Wahhabi heritage. And one of the chief people involved in this process is a man named Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi, who's pictured here. He's a scholar. He lives in Jordan, Palestinian scholar. I've met him, very pleasant man, but still very much responsible for injecting jihadi ideology. The ideas of Wahhabism into jihadi ideology, is one of the chief ideologues of the movement. And what you see here in this picture is that the collection of books behind him it's called the Durar as-Saniya, the Splendid Pearls, which is a collection essentially of the writings of the Wahhabi scholars from the mid-18th century to the early 20th century. So this is kind of the encyclopedia of militant Wahhabism. And he has it behind him because it's essentially, this is the heritage that belongs to us, that we appeal to. They don't acknowledge that the Saudis are the proper stewards of this tradition. One of his first books, called Millat Ibrahim, The Religion of Abraham, from 1984, is essentially just a collection of quotations of militant Wahhabi scholars from the mid-18th century to the early 20th century. And that would be one of the most influential books in the history of the jihadi movement. Now, if you look at what's going on in Saudi Arabia today, what's really interesting is that there was this long period of almost 100 years where the Saudi state, it upheld Wahhabism as a special, as essentially the religion of state. I didn't call it Wahhabism, but it adopted the ideas of Wahhabism in its textbooks. It empowered the Wahhabi scholars, etc. But Mohammed bin Salman, the new crown prince, has said a lot of things lately to the effect that Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab is not so special. His teachings don't necessarily need to be, enshrined today in modern Saudi Arabia. So this is one quote from, I think, uh, 20 early 2022. It was part of Graham Wood's interview with Mohammed bin Salman um, for his article in the Atlantic, and he said to Graham, and this is from an audio statement that he shared with me, an audio file. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he's not a prophet, he's not an angel, he's one scholar in the first Saudi Arabia, that is the first Saudi state, among many scholars, among many political leaders, among many military leaders. So Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is not Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia, you have Sunni and Shiite. In Sunni Islam, you have four madhahib, schools of law. And in Shiite Islam, you have different schools. So what we're seeing today is a very interesting change in terms of Saudi Arabia's relationship to the Wahhabi heritage. It's moving even farther away from the Wahhabi heritage, whereas the jihadi movement is continuing to adopt and appeal to this heritage. And with that, I will end. Thanks.
Great, Cole. Thank you really for that really thorough overview of everything you've done. You've really done a superb job in trying to dissect and trying to understand the entire movement at large. There are a lot of questions. Let me take the prerogative of asking the first question, and then I'll pass it on to Alex, and then we'll go into the audience as well and try to do our best to get to as many questions as possible. So, just on your last point, when you're talking, we're talking about, Mohammed bin Salman today, and kind of how he perceives the Wahhabi movement. Go one step further and talk about that with, one of the more contemporary questions today, as far as normalization with Israel, for example, and this larger debate distinguishing between the Wahhabi movement and what it used to be and where we are now. And given the traditionalism of Wahhabism as far as it relates to non-believers, as it relates to Jews and Christians and whatnot, and how that is understood today in this next kind of political movement going forward under his leadership.
Yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. One of the more interesting developments that I've been following and that I've been writing about, though it hasn't been published yet, is something that Mohammed bin Salman, I'll just call him MBS, as everyone calls him, MBS, Crown Prince. He announced in early 2022 something called Founding Day, Yom Ta'sis, which is a new holiday to be celebrated every February. I think it's February 22nd. Founding Day, as he says, is the founding of the first Saudi state in 1727 with the rise to power of Muhammad ibn Saud. Now, the subtle implication there, not so subtle really, if you follow Saudi history, is that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab and the pact that he had with Muhammad bin Saud, that is not the founding of the first Saudi state. The first Saudi state happens without Wahhabism. This is the new historical narrative that is being pushed and adopted by the leadership in Saudi Arabia. And it involves essentially the idea that we're going to write out Wahhabism from our history. We are Saudis. We go back to before Wahhabism, and it's part of a whole movement, that MBS is spearheading to kind of put Saudi nationalism ahead of any kind of fundamentalist Islam as the basis of legitimacy of the state. So it's really pretty much no one who studied Saudi Arabia believed that it was possible for the ruler of the country to kind of move away from this tradition, the Wahhabi tradition, so fast, really to jettison it. It's not quite, that's perhaps overstating it. You still have a lot of members of the family of the Sheikh Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab who are heading religious institutions, including the Ministry of Islamic Affairs, but they are really not promoting Wahhabism anymore. So I think a lot of that goes to what MBS is trying to do, trying to redefine the foundations, the ideological foundations of the state in a nationalist way, as opposed to an Islamic religious way. And that sort of might allow him to do things like normalize with Israel, because the state is a nationalist state. He can sell that sort of an agreement as being part of what's in the interest of Saudi Arabia as a nation. It goes back to the early 18th century. I still think that that is a dicey proposition. It's shown in a lot of polls that normalization with Israel is not popular. So he would have to really defy the kind of the will of his people to get there. But if he were to do it, he would have to sell it in terms that we are the Saudi nation, we're proud people, we have proud foundations, we're not extremist Muslims, we don't necessarily follow the ideas of Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab, and we're going to go in our own direction. So what's happening today in modern Saudi Arabia is it's just fascinating. It's the amount of change is so quick. It's hard to know what could follow next.
Right. Thank you for that. And of course, we look forward to diving into that in November as well. Alex, let me turn it over to you to ask your question.
Sure. First, thanks very much. A fascinating presentation. So many questions. I'll make one brief comment. I very much appreciated the description of Wahhab against his Central Arabian environment. Just precisely how embroidered or inhabited by saints and spirits the Central Arabian landscape and culture is not really appreciated by most people, certainly not in the West. And his reaction against it. Traditions that go back many thousands of years in some cases, prior to Ibn Wahhab himself. Mm-hmm. That raises the question for me of Wahhab and Wahhabism against the Islamic environment as a whole of the, let's say, the 19th and especially the earlier 20th century. Revival movements, reform movements, the Islamic modernists of the turn of the century, Rashid Rida and Abdu, all of these characters faced with this individual and tradition and eventually a state, at least partially aligned with his theology and doctrines, which are not based in the traditions, intellectual and social traditions of Baghdad, Damascus, or Cairo. And how do we, and it becomes a global movement, actually, thanks to the Saudi state in the 20th century. But how do we understand this one movement among many in the 19th and 20th centuries? And where do we go with that idea?
Thanks, Alex. That's a very good question. So I think that it's important to bear in mind that if you look at what most of the Islamic world said about Wahhabism up to the early 20th century and even later, it was that this is a movement that is heretical. They're the ones who are not proper Muslims, not us. They're accusing us of shirk and kufr, of polytheism and unbelief, and that's just ridiculous and it's offensive. So the idea and the Wahhabis wanted nothing to do with the broader Islamic world. If they weren't going to be able to conquer them and to bring them into the expansionary Saudi state, then the idea was that they should, at a minimum, be shunned and shown hatred and enmity. So this was a movement that didn't want integration, and that's the achievement of King Abdulaziz in the early 20th century was to essentially force integration with the broader Islamic world on the Wahhabi movement, which had the practical effect of diluting the militancy and exclusivism of early Wahhabism. Now, you brought up the issue of other reform movements. And there were, as I'm sure you know, a number of various reformist, revivalist movements across the Islamic world in the 17th, 18th centuries, including in India, in Yemen. And there are doctrinal affinities between the Wahhabis and some of these movements. The principal affinity is the shared appeal to the heritage or the religious thought of Ibn Taymiyyah, the scholar from the 14th century. His ideas were, for whatever reason, they were just very appealing to a broad swath of revivalist intellectual Muslim scholars at this time. And they used his doctrinal principles to rail against the cult of saints, because the cult of saints was everywhere. Now, the writings of the Wahhabis probably exaggerate just how dominant a feature of Islamic practice the cult of saints was. But everywhere the Wahhabis went, they destroyed shrines. They created a new religious environment. Now, when it comes to the other religious movements, contemporary religious movements, some of them they recognized the affinities with the Wahhabis, but they also understood that Wahhabism was going a step further than them. They were not prepared, these other movements, to declare takfir necessarily on their enemies. But those who were against all of these reform movements, they saw them and painted them as very similar. You'll notice in some of the scholarship that has been produced on Wahhabism, particularly in the work of somebody named Ahmed Dalal, he's a very good scholar, but he doesn't seem all that interested in understanding Wahhabism on its own terms. He comes to the conclusion that Wahhabism had nothing at all to do with the other reform movements. And I use an excursus in one of the chapters to demonstrate that isn't really true at all. And I show how Ibn Abdul Wahhab and these other movements appealed very similarly to Ibn Taymiyyah and had other similar ideas.
Great. Thank you for that. Alex, we're going to go on to the audience.
Very good. Thank you.
Great. So Cole, so our friend Michael Brill has two questions. Let me I'll read them to you and you tackle them as well. One, he's asking about have Wahhabi scholars historically generally agreed upon the ranking enemies between Sunni, Shiites, Sufis, and other groups? And second, does the history of Wahhabism explain the ultimate ascendance of the Wahhabi doctrine under the banner of the Islamic State in Iraq post 2003, or was it contingent on the collapse of the Iraqi state? So wherever you want to tackle together or one at a time.
There's this idea that shirk is wahid, that there's all unbelief is kind of one rank. If you commit unbelief, then you have committed unbelief, and you need to be showed hatred and enmity. Now there's certainly distinctions that one can make, but broadly, what made Wahhabism distinctive in this area in this time was that they did not acknowledge a doctrine that is long been acknowledged, including in the writings of Ibn Taymiyyah, that's called al-udhr bil-jahl, or excusing on the basis of ignorance. So Ibn Taymiyyah, for instance, would look at lay Muslims who are praying to saints at shrines and say they are ignorant, and therefore they are excused on the basis of ignorance, and I'm not going to declare them unbelievers, not until the proof has been presented to them and explained to them, etc. Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab rejected this idea. His view was that if they're committing shirk, then they're committing shirk. We need to treat them as mushrikeen, as polytheists. So that applied to Shiites, it applied to Sufis, it applied to not necessarily non-Hanbali adherents. The distinction among law schools, which is quite critical to Islam in social history, did not feature all that much in Wahhabism. One of the early Wahhabi scholars who wrote the first history of Wahhabism, a guy named Ibn Ghanam, he was a Maliki scholar from the Maliki madhab. So one could be a Wahhabi without necessarily being a Hanbali. That's important. Now, when it comes to jump ahead, why not 200 years to ISIS and the Iraq post 2003? I think that obviously the collapse of the Iraqi state was a necessary condition for the rise of first Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and then the Islamic State of Iraq, and then ISIS, or the Islamic State, the so-called caliphate. Wahhabism plays a role. I don't think that it couldn't necessarily have happened without Wahhabism, but I think that the character of the doctrine adopted by the Islamic State is very much influenced by Wahhabism, by the most extreme elements of Wahhabism. And that's why you see the extraordinary intolerance of anyone perceived not to be with the Islamic State to adhere to its doctrine. And that includes the Shia, especially because they are considered prima facie unbelievers given their adherence to Shiism. Sunni Muslims, they're somewhat more tolerant of, they're in some cases given the benefit of the doubt when it comes to their status as Muslims, but they're still extremely intolerant as a group.
Great. Okay, moving on to Bernie Heichel's question. So Bernie has I'll read his question for you. So how do you explain the lack of interest in the caliphate by the Wahhabis? Jihadis seem to be keen on the caliphate by contrast, and where does Maqdisi fit in with respect to the caliphate? Lastly, Bernie comments that he thinks that the pre-modern Arabia society, just as other places in the region, are enchanted with the belief of the kind of the supernatural powers that embedded in the objects, and likely reacting, to this kind of that we see on the shrines in Iraq and in the Hijaz. Do you agree with that?
The issue of the caliphate is very interesting. It's often said that the Wahhabis rebelled against the Ottoman caliphate. Well, the Ottomans really weren't there in the mid-18th century. Oh, and hi, Bernie. Good to have you here, by the way. So they kind of ignore the issue of the caliphate, but they do appeal to the concepts of the imamate and some of the writings by the early Wahhabi scholars. It's understood that, particularly by the later 18th century, that the leader Saud, that first Abdulaziz ibn Muhammad al Saud, and then his successor, his son Saud ibn Abdulaziz, that they are the imam, and therefore the first Wahhabi state is the imamate. But they don't frame it so much in those terms, and they don't put it as a challenge to the Ottoman caliphate. There's really almost a lack of concern with the political arrangement that the Ottoman Empire has. Which I cannot really explain, other than that the Wahhabis saw themselves as resurrecting the early Islamic state in Arabia, and they were following the model of the Prophet Muhammad in their own view. And suppose if you're doing that, you don't necessarily need the language of caliphate to accomplish that. Perhaps the question should be more, why did this issue of the caliphate become so important in the 20th century? And that probably for a whole swath of the Islamic world, and that probably has to do with the fact that the Ottoman Caliphate was destroyed in the 1920s. Where does Maqdisi fit in with respect to the Caliphate? Well, I can't think of actually any particular writing of his where he is overly concerned with reestablishing the Caliphate. That's an interesting question, and it might be because he is particularly influenced by the Wahhabi tradition. It is groups like Al-Qaeda, like the Islamic State of Iraq, that were most concerned in a lot of their discourse with the idea of the caliphate. And that is in some ways at odds with appealing to the Wahhabi heritage, because as you see in a lot of bin Laden statements and also his successor Ayman al-Zawahiri, there is this idea that the end of the Ottoman caliphate was a great tragedy and something that we need to address. And that's what Al-Qaeda is trying to do, to resurrect the caliphate. But that is not in sync with Wahhabi doctrine, which understands the Ottoman state to be to have been a state of shirk. So these things are not in accord. You have a lot of these sort of contradictions in jihadi ideology, and that gets sorted out when it comes to ISIS, which does not appeal to the history of the Ottoman Empire. It's much more in line with ISIS's thinking. It doesn't consider it to have been a proper caliphate. But I suppose that the interest of the modern jihadis with the idea, their fixation on the idea of the caliphate, is something that is acquired perhaps by osmosis from other revivalist Islamic groups in the 20th century. Last question about Arabian society being enchanted with belief in magic and supernatural powers, etc. It's hard to know, in my opinion, how kind of outrageous some of these beliefs that are highlighted in Wahhabi texts, how prominent they were. It's interesting that this was not a society that did not adhere to Islam. You find a lot of the responses to Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab by his peers in Najd. They were saying, this is ridiculous. Of course, we're Muslims. We've had Islam here for centuries. People pray, they fast, they do all the things that are required of lay Muslims. But Muhammad bin Abdul Wahhab was fixated on this idea of what seems to have been not practices that were not just prominent in Najd, or not just occurring at least in Najd, but also everywhere in the Islamic world. So in the early history of Wahhabism of the First Saudi State by Ibn Hanem, which is written in, I think, the 1790s, He talks about what's going on in Nejd in terms of the cult of saints and magic and supernatural things that are not real. He just highlights that as one feature of the problem that extends across the Islamic world. And then he goes into detail about what's going on in Iraq and what's going on in Syria, what's going on in Egypt, and all of these places. So he doesn't seem to create a whole lot of much of a distinction between the shirk in Central Arabia and the shirk in Iraq, Syria, elsewhere. But perhaps there was something that was more painful for Ibn Abdul Wahhab in Nejd, but it doesn't really occur. In that epistle that I highlighted, he brings Abdul Qadir and Shamsen in the same sentence. So he sees this, I think, as the same phenomenon from Iraq to Nejd, shrine visitation. It's reached a point that we need to address and kind of resurrect true Islam.
Wonderful. We have a little bit more time for one or more, two more questions. So let me try to ask another question here. So the next question is, how far is really the spread of Wahhabism globally? And asking whether the connection between, obviously you talk about in the book between the jihadi Salafite connection and Wahhabism, but can you comment about it spreading, especially these days in the Horn of Africa at large?
Yeah, very, very good question. Wahhabism spreads in the 20th century, by the way, not in terms of Wahhabism, but in terms of Salafism. Salafism, which Bernie Hakel has written about in detail, is a purist movement in Sunni Islam that goes back at least to the time of Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim al-Jawziyah. There's a lot of shared features with Wahhabism. I think of Wahhabism as a subset of the larger Salafi movement. It's the more kind of puritanical, it's even more puritanical, it's even more militant and exclusivist than sort of your catch-all Salafism. So when the Saudi state is spreading Wahhabism or Salafism in the 20th century, it's doing so as this is the Salafi dawah. But the writings of the Wahhabis are also transmitted. So even if you go into a Salafi mosque today in Philadelphia, you'll find the collection of writings that was behind Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi and the picture that I showed. So it has spread. It's certainly spread to Africa. A lot of that probably has to do with what the Saudis were doing, particularly from the 1970s, in spreading Wahhabism. You see today, I don't know so much the Horn of Africa. I'm looking more in my own work at what's going on in the Sahel and Mali and places like that. And a lot of the groups that have arisen there that are allied or affiliated with Al-Qaeda and ISIS, they certainly appeal to the militant Wahhabi heritage. So these ideas they transmit. One reason I think they transmit, it's not just because of historical Saudi promotion of them, but they're fairly easy to grasp. It's easy to understand, oh, that's what Tawheed is. That's what Shirk is. And we're going to fight on this basis. I should have also mentioned earlier that when it comes to Abu Muhammad al-Maqdisi and the jihadis appropriating the Wahhabi heritage, they are concerned with shrine visitation, but they have taken his heritage and applied it to a new object of concern, which is what they see as legal political shirk, the idea that Islamic law is not being applied, that the ruler is not that rulers across the modern Islamic world are not applying Islamic law. They are applying man-made laws, and in that sense, they are sharing in God's divine sovereignty, violating Tawheed, committing shirk. So that's the new shirk that is being opposed by the jihadis.
Great, thank you.
And you also see that in the Horn of Africa, I should have said, in Shabab's writings, etc.
Right. Great. Okay, we have Alex. I'm going to let you have the last question for today. So, trying to keep to our time frame, and then obviously, hopefully we can continue the conversation at a later day, and of course, obviously in person in DC. Alex, go ahead.
Sure. Let me conclude by bringing it back to today, and by today I mean September 11th, and that is the question of significant, let me be understated, significant policy decisions were made in the wake of September 11th What was and what is the level of understanding in the Western intellectual and policy communities regarding Wahhabism and these kinds of religious issues, theological and social issues?
That's a good question. I'd say it's generally not good. I've interacted with a number of officials from three-letter agencies in Washington that do understand a lot of the niceties, that are quite concerned with them. But I've also talked to a lot who have very little understanding of it. And part of that isn't necessarily their fault. I think that academic attention to Wahhabism was so poor that it led to it allowed for books to be published with university presses that say things like the founder of Wahhabism is a feminist and a peaceful guy, and even tolerant, more tolerant than Ibn Taymiyyah. So I think that we've come a long way in understanding these movements. I think that what you saw after 9/11 was a whole great deal of writing that was against Saudi Arabia, saying that they had infected Islam globally with these pernicious ideas, and that had given us 9/11. And a lot of that, I think, is overstating the case. It doesn't understand what Wahhabism really is, what is the version of Wahhabism that's being promoted here. If you look at the 9/11 attackers, I don't see them as being principally motivated by Wahhabism. They're motivated by a particular strategy that is to get the United States out of the Middle East. Bin Laden, as I said, he would appeal to the idea of the Ottoman Empire resurrecting the caliphate, which the Wahhabis considered to be a state of shirk. A lot of that doesn't make any sense. I mean, a lot of these niceties, I think that they had to be better understood in Washington when you had ISIS versus Al Qaeda, because you saw in ISIS a group that was extremely puritanical, unforgiving of any sort of violation of doctrinal purity. And then you saw Al Qaeda try to kind of position itself as the group that appeals to the masses, to al-Hadina Shabia, the general embrace. So there's that. And then when it comes to what Saudi Arabia is doing today, I'm not sure it's really understood how much of a change is really taking place today. I've seen certain academics kind of dismiss a lot of the moves that MBS has taken. I don't know actually in Washington the extent to which this is appreciated or not, but I think that the effects, the ramifications of Saudi Arabia distancing itself from Wahhabism, decoupling from Wahhabism, even the watered down version of Wahhabism that it's endorsed for the last almost 100 years, that will have significant effects globally on Islam.
Great. Cole, thank you for that thorough discussion. You know, there's a lot, you've done a phenomenal job here, and really, I want to recommend your book to everybody who joined us this afternoon. I want to thank you, of course, for taking the time to join us as well. I want to thank the audience for coming. Please be on the lookout for future webinars. I want to thank my colleagues, as always, Alex, Emily, and Suzanne for helping out making this happen. And above all, Cole, for joining us and sharing your work and your research all around.
Thanks.
Want to wish everybody a good day, and we will talk soon.